Imagine you find yourself in the 13th century. You only have a hut, some straw, and a little bread. Will you survive? Most likely not. But people did survive, using a few simple tricks. What were they? Survival depended not on luck, but on knowledge and the ability to apply it in practice. Our ancestors knew how to cope with extreme conditions using simple and ingenious solutions. Their methods had been honed over centuries, and it was these methods that allowed them to survive the harshest winters. Watch the video to the end to find out how people survived in the harsh realities of the Middle Ages, where every mistake meant certain death, where to find resources for life when there were no stores or medicines, and the only source of heat was a stove that had to be constantly stoked. Imagine that you are in the middle of a vast, hilly area, and you need to choose just one place for your future hut. This decision cannot be rushed or made in error, because in medieval times, any miscalculation could cost you your life. Unlike modern people, you couldn't just pick up and move if something went wrong. Therefore, choosing a location for a home was not just an intuitive decision, but a complex and careful calculation based on centuries of observation of nature and the environment. It was a true art of survival where every detail was critical to the future. The southern slope was always considered the ideal location for construction. It provided reliable protection from the piercing north winds that could bring icy cold in winter. At the same time, the slope had to be high enough to protect the dwelling from spring floods, but not too steep. Otherwise, the earth could crumble during prolonged rains, threatening the integrity of the building. Medieval people never built houses in low-lying areas, as they knew that cold air accumulated there, and it would be almost impossible to heat such a dwelling. Every hour of sunlight was worth its weight in gold, so the location was chosen so that the sun appeared above the horizon with the first rays and set last. Orientation towards the sun played a key role in passive heating. The southern slope allowed maximum use of solar heat, which significantly reduced the consumption of firewood. In addition, this location helped combat dampness, as direct sunlight dried the walls and roof of the hut. This was vital for preserving materials and preventing rot. Proximity to a water source, whether a stream or a well, was one of the most important factors in choosing a location. However, there were subtleties and nuances to consider here as well. Water was never taken from low-lying areas, where dirty rainwater or meltwater could accumulate, making it unfit for drinking. On the contrary, the water source had to be located above the hut, on high ground. This location allowed the water to flow down naturally, ensuring its purity and freshness. In addition, it was extremely important to make sure that the stream would not dry up in the summer or freeze completely in the harsh winter frosts. Choosing such a place could take a person several days or even weeks of careful exploration of the area. Before driving in the first stake, he carefully studied all the natural features: wind direction, sun position, soil characteristics, and groundwater level. The hut itself was a real engineering marvel, created from the simplest and most accessible materials at hand. The walls were built from a special mixture of clay mixed with chopped straw and horsehair. This mixture was not just a building material, but also an excellent natural insulator that effectively retained heat inside. The walls could reach an impressive 1/2 meter in thickness, providing reliable protection from the cold and wind. To prevent rot, which could be caused by moisture from the ground, the bottom row of logs was raised onto a solid stone foundation. This simple but ingenious solution significantly extended the life of the entire structure. The outer layer of the walls was covered with lime, or an additional layer of clay, which not only protected them from precipitation, but also gave them additional strength. The hut did not have the windows we are used to. Instead, small, very narrow openings were used. They were located exclusively on the south side to let in as much sunlight as possible and were closed with a bull's bladder or oiled cloth. This allowed a little light into the interior without letting precious heat escape. These small windows were additionally protected by wooden shutters. The shutters were double, and straw was laid between the leaves. This simple but effective method created an air cushion that served as an additional layer of insulation. The entrance door was deliberately made low and narrow to minimize the amount of cold air entering the hut each time it was opened. The door opened inwards, which also helped to prevent drafts. To provide additional protection from the cold, there was a small vestibule between the outer and inner doors. This airlock effectively protected the hut from drafts and sudden temperature changes. The threshold was made high enough so that cold air flowing along the ground could not enter the dwelling. The roof was made with a very steep slope. This was necessary to prevent heavy snow from accumulating on it, which could lead to its collapse. At the same time, a thin layer of snow was even desirable, as it served as additional insulation. The roof was made of multiple layers using straw, reeds, or turf. The thicker this cake of natural materials was, the better the house retained heat. There were no separate rooms inside the hut. The entire space was one large room. This layout was dictated by practicality. A large space is much easier to heat, as the heat from the hearth spread throughout the entire volume. The sleeping areas were located on special platforms or lofts, where warm air rose, providing additional comfort during sleep. If you imagine that all this was done without modern tools, it becomes clear that building such a hut was a real feat. How long do you think such a project would have taken a medieval person? In a world without modern technology, refrigerators, and canned food, food storage was elevated to the rank of a true art. For border families who could not count on regular deliveries from stores, everything they were going to eat during the long winter had to be prepared in the summer and fall. This was not just routine work, but a complex, multi-level strategy on whose success the survival of the entire family directly depended. Every decision regarding preparation was dictated by centuries of experience and knowledge of nature. Grain, as the basis of nutrition, was of paramount importance. It was stored in special barns, which were built using a special technology, on stilts high above the ground. This design had a dual purpose. It protected the valuable supply from the destructive effects of moisture and served as a reliable barrier against rodents that could destroy the entire crop. A huge amount of grain was needed to feed oneself and one's family throughout the winter. 100 to 200 kilograms were stored per person, and for a large family, this supply could reach a ton. The grain was not ground in advance, but as needed. Hand mills were used for this purpose. This approach allowed the grain to remain fresh, protecting it from spoilage. In addition, it prevented the formation of pests that could infest the flour. It was slow and laborious, but it provided the family with fresh bread and porridge throughout the winter. Meat was a real luxury and was mainly prepared in the fall, before the first frosts. Livestock was slaughtered only when the air temperature dropped below zero. This was important because in such conditions, the meat froze naturally. This allowed it to be stored throughout the winter without the risk of spoilage. Some of the meat was preserved by salting. It was placed in large wooden barrels and covered with concentrated brine. Salt was one of the oldest and most effective preservatives. Another part of the meat was smoked over slowly smoldering sawdust, which gave it a special taste and aroma. Smoking created a protective layer on the surface of the meat, which prevented the growth of bacteria and extended its shelf life. Vegetables, in turn, were stored in specially equipped underground cellars. They were covered with sand or dry earth. This method helped to maintain a stable temperature and humidity. Thanks to this, the vegetables did not rot and could remain fresh for a long time, retaining their nutritional properties. Sauerkraut occupied a special place in the diet. It was fermented in large wooden barrels. This product was not just food, but the main source of vitamin C during the cold season. Sauerkraut helped prevent scurvy, a deadly disease caused by a lack of this vitamin. Berries and mushrooms also occupied an important place in the food supply. They were harvested and dried in the sun or in an oven. Dried berries, for example, retain their vitamins and could be stored for years, becoming a valuable addition to the meager winter diet. After drying, mushrooms were used as a flavorful seasoning and added to soups and stews for extra substance. Dried supplies were stored in natural fabric bags or clay pots. This protected them from moisture and pests. Thanks to this method, even in the harshest frosts, families could enjoy the gifts of summer and autumn, supplementing their diet with nutrients. The distribution of all these supplies required the strictest accounting and planning. Families calculated in advance how much of each product they could afford to spend per day to ensure that their supplies would last until spring. A poor harvest or a long, drawn-out winter could result in real famine. So they always kept a small, untouchable reserve in case of unforeseen circumstances. In addition to food, the overall balance of survival also took into account the costs of firewood for heating, water, and electricity. Every aspect of life in the border zone was part of a complex system where any mistake could lead to catastrophic consequences. That is why every family treated their preparations with the utmost responsibility, understanding that their future depended on it. In the harsh, long winter, water went from being an abundant resource to a real scarcity. Wells could freeze completely, streams could be covered with a thick layer of ice that was impossible to break through, and melting snow required a huge amount of precious fuel. Every source of water presented a difficult challenge. Therefore, medieval people developed many ways to provide themselves and their families with this vital resource. To prevent wells from freezing, even in the most severe frosts, they were built in a special, well-thought-out way. Log cabins were covered with a thick layer of natural insulators, earth, sawdust, and hay. This coat reliably protected the walls of the well from freezing. A double insulated cover was made on top, which served as an additional barrier against the cold. An important detail was the depth of the well. It had to reach the unfrozen groundwater, which, being at a depth, always maintained a constant temperature above zero. Even with all these precautions, the well could still freeze. In this case, it was heated with hot coals or boiling water. This was dangerous and extremely hard work that required patience. Hot coals were placed directly on the ice and boiling water was poured on it, gradually destroying the ice cover. It was important to do this carefully so as not to damage the wooden frame. To break through the thick layer of ice, special iron ice picks were used, heavy pointed crowbars. If the well was too difficult to break through, or if there was no well at all, the alternative was to cut a hole in the nearest body of water. They cut it with an axe or the same ice pick. To prevent the hole from freezing, they covered it with boards and a thick layer of straw. This created additional insulation, which slowed down the formation of ice. However, despite all these tricks, the hole required daily attention and care. Every day it had to be cleared of a thin layer of ice so that it would not freeze completely. Melting snow was always considered a last resort and was only used when all other means of obtaining water were unavailable. To get just one bucket of water, several buckets of snow had to be melted. Snow has a very low density, so a huge amount of firewood was required to melt it. This was incredibly inefficient in terms of fuel consumption, which was already in short supply. Water conservation was not just desirable, but a vital rule. Water was used repeatedly, following a strict order. First, it was used for drinking, then for cooking. After that, the same water could be used for washing dishes and then for laundry. And only at the very end, when it was no longer suitable for other purposes, was it used for household needs, such as washing floors. This approach allowed for the most efficient use of every liter of precious moisture. At the center of every medieval home, regardless of its size and the wealth of its owners, stood a massive stove. Its importance cannot be overestimated, as the very survival of the entire family depended on its proper construction and operation. It was not just a source of heat, but the true center of all life. All daily life revolved around it, and it was the heart of the home, a symbol of comfort and security in a harsh and hostile world. Its importance was so great that it can be compared to how we now perceive electricity or running water. Without it, existence would be impossible. The stove was an ingenious, though primitive at first glance, structure built from a mixture of clay and stone. Thanks to its enormous mass, it could accumulate a tremendous amount of thermal energy. Its walls were an impressive half a meter thick, which allowed it to give off heat evenly throughout the day, cooling slowly. This principle of thermal inertia ensured a stable temperature in the house without constant heating. As a result, one fire was enough for a full 24 hours of comfortable warmth. The huge furnace was designed to accommodate whole logs up to a meter long, which meant that the furnace needed to be loaded less often and ensured even and long-lasting combustion. This was critically important for saving time and effort, as preparing firewood was an incredibly laborious process. An additional advantage was that the large firebox allowed even damp or not completely dry wood to be burned, which open fireplaces could not provide. The stove was a truly multifunctional device that performed many tasks. Its oven was used not only for baking bread, which was the staple food, but also for drying clothes, shoes, mushrooms, and medicinal herbs. This helped to keep the house tidy and clean, as well as preserve valuable supplies for a long time. The stove also served as a sleeping place, a couch which was the warmest place in the house. This is where the youngest and oldest members of the family slept, as it provided them with comfort and protection from the cold, which was especially important for those who were most vulnerable. The bench was not just a place to sleep, but a center of attraction where one could warm up and rest after a hard day. Handling the stove required a lot of experience and caution, as incorrect actions could lead to tragedy. The stove damper played a critical role in regulating the draft and retaining heat after firing. Closing the damper too early could cause carbon monoxide poisoning, which accumulated inside the house. This invisible and deadly gas was a constant threat. Therefore, working with the stove was passed down from generation to generation as an important craft that required attention to detail and a deep understanding of the principles of combustion. People knew that you couldn't mess around with fire. Preparing fuel for the stove was a daily, incredibly laborious task. One family needed 15 to 20 cubic meters of firewood for the whole winter, which is a huge pile of wood. This required enormous physical effort. Firewood began to be chopped, sawn, and split in the summer so that it would have time to dry completely before the onset of cold weather. Dry firewood burned more efficiently, giving off more heat and less soot, which was critically important. It was carefully stacked in wood piles so that it would not get wet or rot, which required special skill and attention. All the necessary items for daily life were placed around the stove, and all important events took place there. Laundry and shoes were dried there, food was prepared, and people warmed themselves after long hours of work in the cold. The stove was not just a household item, but the true center of family life. It was around the stove that people gathered in the evenings to talk, tell stories, or simply enjoy the warmth and comfort. It was a place where families came together, where traditions were passed on, and where there was peace and security. The stove was more than just a source of heat. It was a symbol of home and survival. Survival in the bitter, piercing cold was completely impossible without the right, well-designed clothing. Border families without access to modern materials developed a unique multi-layer system that allowed them not only to survive, but to actively work and live in temperatures that would be deadly to an unprepared person. This system was the result of centuries of observation, trial, and error. Each layer of clothing had its own unique function and was vital for keeping the body warm and dry. The basis of winter clothing has always been underwear. It was made of thin but warm wool or linen. The main task of this layer was to fit snugly to the body in order to wick away moisture and retain the heat generated by the body. Moisture remaining on the skin cools quickly, leading to hypothermia, so it was essential that the first layer remain dry. A second layer was worn over the underwear, a shirt or jacket made of thicker woolen fabric. This layer created the necessary air gap, which served as the main heat insulator. Air, being an excellent insulator, retained heat, preventing it from escaping outside. Finally, the outer clothing was a true work of art in survival. Sheepskin coats were worn with the wool on the inside, which created ideal thermal insulation. The outer leather layer repelled moisture and wind, while the inner wool layer retained body heat. Tulips, long sheepskin coats, often reaching down to the ankles, were clothing for the harshest, most extreme frosts. Headwear was critically important, as the body loses up to 40% of its heat through the head. Malachi, warm hats with long ears and a back section, completely covered the head, neck, cheeks, and even the chin. This provided maximum protection from the biting wind and cold. For the hands, mittens were preferred over gloves. Their advantage was that all the fingers were together, warming each other, which allowed them to retain heat much more effectively than in the separate houses of gloves. Mittens were often made of sheepskin or thick wool, which provided additional protection. Footwear required special attention and careful selection. Felt boots were ideal for dry snow, as felt retained heat well. However, they were vulnerable to moisture, so to protect against slush and wet snow, they were worn with thick leather or rubber galoshes if available. Instead of socks, footcloths were used, long strips of fabric that were wrapped around the feet. They were preferred to socks because footcloths could be easily rewound, evenly distributing pressure and heat. And if one side got wet, it could simply be turned over. This was very convenient and practical. Spare clothing was not just a convenience, but a necessity. Wet or torn clothing in severe frost could mean certain death from hypothermia. Therefore, every family had several sets of clothes in case of unforeseen situations. Clothes were treated with incredible care. They were constantly repaired, patched, and re-sewn, passed down from older to younger generations. Not a single piece of fabric was wasted. This careful attitude toward clothing ensured survival and the transfer of valuable experience from generation to generation. The long and harsh winter, in complete isolation from the outside world, was not only a serious physical challenge, but also a profound psychological one. Months without communication with neighbors, monotony, constant darkness, and piercing cold could lead to despair and even madness. To counter this, frontier families developed a whole range of ways to maintain morale and preserve mental health. They understood that without inner strength and hope, physical survival lost all meaning.
Just a flicker in the distance.
Family traditions and rituals played a key role in structuring monotonous winter life. Storytelling was an essential part of family leisure time. Older family members passed on family legends, folk tales, and stories of heroes and adventures to younger members. These stories not only entertained, but also conveyed life experiences, shaped values, and strengthened the bond between generations. Music and singing also brought the family together and lifted spirits. Simple musical instruments such as pipes, flutes, or homemade drums were available even in the most remote areas. Singing together, whether folk songs or spiritual hymns, created a sense of community and filled the home with life and joy. Handicrafts were not only a necessity, but also a means of self-expression. Women embroidered, knitted, and wove, creating items that were not only useful, but also beautiful. These patterns and ornaments often carried deep symbolic meaning, reflecting the culture and history of the family. Men, in turn, carved wood, forged tools, and made toys for children. This creativity helped them cope with stress, distracted them from the harsh reality, and allowed them to feel like creators of something new and beautiful. Games and entertainment brightened up the long winter evenings. Games such as cards, checkers, and chess were popular. They not only helped pass the time, but also developed a strategic thinking.
This is how you make the mark.
Education was also an important part of winter life. Adults found time to teach children to read and write. Older people shared practical knowledge with younger ones. How to repair tools, how to store food properly, how to care for animals. It was a kind of homeschool of survival. Religious practices provided spiritual support in the most difficult times. Prayers, reading the Bible or other sacred texts, observing fasts and holidays created a clear rhythm of life. These rituals gave hope for a better future, reminding people of the cyclical nature of life. Faith helped people find meaning in their suffering and endure hardship. It was a source of strength that allowed them to retain their humanity and remain steadfast in circumstances where everything around them seemed to be against them.
It's cracked.
Even the most prepared frontier family, with stored food and warm clothing, could face unforeseen and life-threatening circumstances. Fire, sudden illness, critical fuel shortages, or stove breakdowns. Any of these situations could be fatal in the harsh winter conditions. In these circumstances, survival depended not only on supplies, but also on the ability to make quick decisions and act. A crisis plan, albeit unwritten, was part of every family's life. People understood that they could only rely on themselves and their loved ones. Fire was the most terrible threat. A wooden house, which took months to build, could burn down in a matter of minutes, leaving the family homeless in the bitter cold. Understanding this threat, people prepared emergency plans in advance. In case of loss of their main dwelling, the family had to know where to seek shelter. The simplest but most life-saving option was a dugout. It was a hole in the ground that was dug in advance and then covered with logs, branches, and a thick layer of snow. In such a dugout, albeit primitive, a family could survive for several days until they decided what to do next. The dugout protected from wind and snow, and the warmth of the earth helped maintain a minimum temperature. Backup heat sources were prepared in advance and were part of crisis preparedness. In addition to the main stove, people had other ways to keep warm in critical situations. Portable braziers with coals could provide local heat to keep a person from freezing. Hot water bottles or even simple stones heated in the stove could be used to warm hands and feet. These simple but effective methods help maintain body heat. Illnesses were especially dangerous in winter. Without access to professional doctors and modern medicines, people had to rely on folk medicine and knowledge of medicinal herbs. People knew which decoctions could reduce fever and which could relieve coughs. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation and was the only hope in the fight against illness. Mutual assistance between neighbors was not just an act of kindness, but the basis for survival in border areas. Families shared their last food supplies if someone ran out. In the event of a fire or illness, neighbors would come to the rescue with fuel and provide temporary shelter to those affected. This solidarity was the only social protection in the wild. Without it, it would have been impossible to survive alone. It was an unspoken agreement based on trust and understanding. Crisis preparedness included not only material supplies, but also psychological resilience. People had to be prepared for the fact that at any moment, everything could go wrong. This mental toughness, developed over years, allowed people not to panic in difficult situations, but to focus on finding a solution. People were prepared to resort to extreme measures and did not lose hope. This readiness and belief in their own strength were ultimately what distinguished the survivors from those who were unable to withstand the circumstances. For the border families, the arrival of spring was not just a change of season, but a true resurrection after long months of struggling to survive. The first signs of warming, the timid sun, raindrops, melting snow, were met with great hope and joy. People felt that the hardest period was behind them. However, despite its life-giving power, spring also brought with it new and special challenges and dangers for which one had to be prepared. It was a period full of contrasts, relief from the passing cold and tension from the dangers ahead. The first and most serious threat of spring was flooding. The rapid melting of the huge amount of snow that had accumulated over the winter turned quiet streams into turbulent, unpredictable torrents that flooded the lowlands, sweeping away everything in their path. For those who had carelessly built their homes too close to the water, this could spell disaster. Ice drifts also posed a deadly danger. Huge breaking ice floes moved with a roar along the rivers, capable of destroying bridges and sweeping away coastal buildings that had survived the winter. The thaw made the roads completely impassable. The thawed, moisture-saturated ground turned into impenetrable mud, making it impossible to travel long distances. This temporarily isolated families again until the ground dried out enough to be traversable. By the end of winter, the human body was completely exhausted. The reserves of vitamins obtained in summer and autumn were running out. This led to vitamin deficiency, and people suffered from general exhaustion. Their immunity was weakened, and even a common cold could become a serious threat. The first spring plants, young nettles, dandelion leaves, birch buds, became a real salvation. They provided the body with vital vitamins that were so lacking. People tried to gather these gifts of nature as quickly as possible. Depleted reserves required urgent measures. By spring, the last supplies were eaten, and families switched to starvation rations to stretch what was left until the new harvest. Every piece of bread was strictly accounted for. Spring work began immediately after the snow melted. It was necessary to immediately repair all the damage caused to houses and farm buildings by the harsh winter. Then the plots had to be cleared of the remaining snow and ice. And finally, the most important task was to prepare the land for sowing. There was very little time and an incredible amount of work to be done. Every minute counted because the future harvest and survival of the next winter depended on timely sowing. With the restoration of roads and the resumption of communication between settlements, social ties were strengthened once again. People could finally exchange news, talk about how they had survived the winter, share their experiences, and, most importantly, exchange seeds and tools needed for fieldwork. People planned joint efforts to clear roads, build bridges, and erect communal structures. This solidarity was vital, as it allowed them to effectively tackle tasks that could not be accomplished alone. It was a time of renewed hope and collaboration.
Listen closely, my child.
Knowledge about survival in extreme conditions was passed down from generation to generation as the most valuable inheritance. It was more important than gold, jewels, or any other material goods, because without it, the family would be doomed to perish in the first harsh winter. This knowledge was not just a set of rules, but a complex multi-level system that covered all aspects of life and allowed people to survive in the most unfavorable conditions. The transfer of this experience was well established and effective, covering all aspects of life. The process was so natural that it became an integral part of everyday life. This knowledge was not written down, but lived in every person, in every family. Survival training began as soon as a child took its first steps. 3-year-olds already knew not to leave the door open during the cold season and understood why it was necessary to save firewood. They learned these basic rules of safety and economy simply by observing adults and repeating after them. Knowledge was not memorized, but absorbed naturally. It was informal but extremely effective education that prepared children for life from the very beginning. Children did not learn from books, but in practice, in real-life situations, which made their knowledge solid and applicable. Practical skills were learned through observation and imitation. Boys constantly watched their fathers, learning to chop wood, tend livestock, and repair tools. They gradually took on male responsibilities, becoming full-fledged assistants. This process was continuous and lasted for years until the child became a master. Girls helped their mothers cook, spin thread, and care for their younger brothers and sisters. In this way, they mastered all the intricacies of housekeeping on which the well-being of the entire family depended. They learned not only to cook, but also to heal, sew, and keep things in order. Oral traditions were the main way of preserving and transmitting important information. In a world where writing was rare, omens, proverbs, and fairy tales were a veritable library of knowledge. These oral traditions helped people understand nature and its laws and plan their actions. Sayings such as "a red sunset means wind" or "smoke drifts mean rain" contained centuries of observations of nature. They made it possible to predict the weather and plan agricultural work. This knowledge was critical because it helped people avoid mistakes.
The adze, boy, it needs to sing.
Mentoring connected older and younger members of the family and community. Experienced elders, wise from life experience, passed on their knowledge and skills to teenagers. This direct connection ensured the continuity of experience, allowing critical mistakes that could cost lives to be avoided. The elders taught young people not only crafts, but also patience, perseverance, and wisdom. They told stories about past winters and how their ancestors had survived. This strengthened their spirit and instilled confidence in their abilities. In addition to general skills, there was specialized knowledge that was passed down as part of craft traditions. Blacksmiths, carpenters, bakers, and other craftsmen taught their sons the intricacies of their trade, honing their skills to perfection. This knowledge provided the community with everything it needed, from reliable tools to fresh bread. Women's knowledge included recipes for remedies, methods of preserving and storing food, as well as sewing and knitting skills. This information was passed down from mother to daughter and was no less important for survival, as it was responsible for the health and well-being of the entire family. In conditions where the winter sun appeared for only a few hours or not at all, and the polar night could last for weeks, the creation of artificial lighting became a matter not of comfort, but of survival. Without light, it was impossible to perform daily tasks, cook food, or mend clothes, so every family made enormous efforts to provide themselves with sources of light. A splinter was the most common and accessible source of light. It was made from birch or pine chips, split in a special way so that they burned with a bright and even flame. The splints were fixed in special holders called light holders. These iron devices allowed the angle and brightness of the flame to be adjusted and also collected ash, preventing fires. A burning splint gave off a bright but short-lived light and had to be changed frequently. Nevertheless, it was indispensable because of its availability, as wood was everywhere. The use of splints required constant attention, as they left behind a lot of soot and could cause a fire. Tallow candles were made from beef or mutton fat, which was melted and poured into molds. The wick was made from linen or hemp threads. Candles burned longer than splinters and gave off a softer light, but required constant care. The wick had to be trimmed to avoid soot and uneven burning. Oil lamps used hemp, linen, or fish oil. The simplest lamp was a small bowl of oil with a wick dipped into it. Such lamps gave off a soft, even light, leaving almost no soot, but required constant replenishment with oil, which was a valuable product. Later, with the development of technology, kerosene lamps appeared, which became a real revolution in lighting. They gave off a bright, white light and burned without odor. But kerosene was expensive and not always available in remote areas, which made them a luxury item. Every drop of oil and every piece of fat was counted, so burning time was strictly controlled. Fuel for lighting was expensive, and lights were only lit when absolutely necessary. Families went to bed early and got up at dawn, saving every drop of oil and every piece of candle. The use of open flames required extreme caution. Safety was critically important. Lamps were placed in stable candlesticks, away from flammable materials. Containers of water or sand were always kept nearby to extinguish any possible fires. Any spark could turn into a disaster and destroy the house. Daylight was also used to the maximum. Windows, no matter how small, were carefully cleaned of ice and snow. White walls and ceilings helped reflect even the scantest winter light, making the room brighter. This simple but effective solution helped save fuel and made life in the house easier. Light was not just a functional necessity, it also had a deep social significance. Evening gatherings around the hearth, lit by a torch or candle, were a time for conversation, storytelling, and handicrafts. It brought the family together, creating a feeling of comfort and security. In a world plunged into darkness, this small flame symbolized life, hope, and strength of spirit, allowing people to resist despair. We conclude our journey into the world of frontier family survival. Today we learned that life on the edge of civilization required not only physical endurance, but also deep knowledge, ingenuity, and unyielding will. These families created an entire system of survival, From the architecture of their homes to methods of food preservation, from clothing to psychological practices. Their experience shows that people can adapt to the harshest conditions if they have knowledge and determination. Many of these methods are still used today by rescue services, travelers, and residents of remote areas. The wisdom of our ancestors remains relevant in a world where natural disasters and extreme situations continue to threaten human life. Which of the survival methods used by frontier families did you find most important or surprising? Could you apply this knowledge in modern conditions? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to learn more about how people survived in the most difficult conditions.